We're going to gather together this evening for what's to be a stirring conversation, a challenging opportunity for us all to have our hearts transformed, our eyes opened, maybe perhaps even some scales fall from our eyes physically and spiritually. We're excited this evening to have a conversation led by a wonderful scholar, a in the streets, on the movement theologian, Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove, author of many books, most recently Revolution of Values. We're also extremely thankful, as you can see here in the inner fishbowl, of wonderful leaders in our community whom will introduce themselves throughout the evening and their role in our immediate context here in Charlotte. So thank you guys so much for being here. If you have any needs or questions, just look me up. I'm in a black jacket. Bathrooms are out that door. There's water. There's candy. These books will be for sale at the end of the evening. They're back there on the table. More importantly, after the evening concludes, we invite you to stay and do as you were doing earlier. Mingle, have conversations, pick each other's brains about what you heard. Allow things to be illumined to you in a different way through some peer-to-peer learning. So let's now go to God in prayer. God, free us from the things of today that will hold us back from learning and seeing fresh. Free us from the things that will keep us from hearing you in a new way. God, give energy, wisdom, and insight as our presenters speak this evening, as our listeners hear for new movement. We ask this in your name. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you, Nathan, and thanks to everyone in the circle here. It's a little bit difficult with this circle to maybe see who's talking, so I'll raise my hand. I'm right here in the circle. My name's Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove. But quickly, a word on why we're gathering in this way. Tonight is a exciting night for me because I've written this book, Revolution of Values, and this is actually the first time that anybody has gotten a copy of it, because the books literally came to my porch this morning, and I drove here with them. So this is the launch event. But I wrote this book because I want to have a conversation with faith communities and with people in the United States about how we live out our values in this moment. Values means different things to different people, but in many ways, I think it's fair to say that the family values movement, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how that came to be, but the family values movement as a political reality in this country has built for 40 years to create a kind of dichotomy in this country that has led us into a moral crisis. I was just talking to Nathan about this because he just got back from the border. One of the ways of saying this is that 40 years ago, a movement that was called the Family Values Movement started and began shaping the public discourse about values in our life in such a way that today, family values politics is literally supporting ripping families apart at our border, right? This is the moral crisis that we're living in the midst of. And yet, as people of faith, we have deeply held convictions, and we want to figure out how to live those out in public life. So that's what this conversation is about. We gathered in a circle because I really do want it to be a conversation. And one of the things I've learned over the years is that circles that we can step in and out of are places where we can have genuine exchanges. And that's what we're going to try to do here. I'm grateful to these members of your community who are living out their values in your public life right here in Charlotte for coming and being willing to share how they're doing that and why. So we're going to get to that shortly. But we have a couple of open chairs here so that when we do get to that part, we want to invite those of you who have something you want to contribute to join the circle. And there are microphones here because, we do want everybody to be able to hear. This is this isn't quite sitting around the dinner table and talking through things, but we're going to get as close as we can. Because I believe in circles. I believe in circles in part because I grew up in a family that played bluegrass music on Saturday nights. And at the end of every bluegrass session, we sang, "Will the circle be unbroken? By and by, Lord, by and by." And that basic truth of the way God wants to catch us up into a circle that is the beloved community is, for me, the heart of what living out the gospel really is about. My people taught me to sing, but I learned from people in the freedom movement that when we get together, we ought to sing songs that make us into a community. So before we get started, I wanted to see if we could sing together a little bit. Is that all right? Bernice Johnson Reagan, one of the great freedom song leaders of the civil rights movement, she says when we get together, we need to sing because the point of the song is to get to the singing, and the point of the singing is to make us into a community. And so I think if we're going to have a community conversation, it might help us to sing a little bit. And I was thinking as I was driving over here about this song that's fairly simple, and you probably know the words, but I think it can take us right into this question of how we live out our faith in public life, because all of these songs can be adapted to the moment that we're in. So let's sing this song that goes, "Guide my feet while I run this race. Guide my feet, Lord, while I run this race. Oh, Lord, guide my feet, Lord, while I run this race. 'Cause I don't want to run this race in vain." We're getting it. Say, hold my hand. Hold my hand while I run this race. Hold my hand while I run this race. Oh, Lord, hold my hand, Lord, while I run this race. 'Cause I don't want to run this race in vain. Now in the movement, you can also sing it like this. Guide my vote, Lord, while I run this race. Guide my vote, Lord, while I run this race. Oh, Lord, guide my vote, Lord, while I run this race. 'Cause I don't want to run this race in vain. All right, give yourselves a hand. It's good to sing together. I want to begin with a story I began this book with about some folks down at the border in El Paso, Texas, who invited some of us with the Poor People's Campaign. Have you heard of the Poor People's Campaign? Learn more at poorpeoplescampaign.org. Or get out your phone and text MORAL, MORAL, to 90975. I'm always recruiting. But the Poor People's Campaign was invited by one of our partners down at the border back in 2017 after the Trump administration had begun to roll out its so-called zero tolerance policy. We were invited down there to see the impact that policy and policies that had preceded it, frankly, for a few administrations, were impacting that community. The folks there in El Paso have started something they call the Border Network for Human Rights. I was fascinated to meet mostly women in their community who have organized circles like this that meet in living rooms. And I said, well, what do you do when you meet in living rooms? I mean, I'm from the church. I'm used to small group meetings. What do y'all do when you get together? They said, well, we have a text. They pulled one out of their pocket. I said, oh, let me see. What is it? It's the U.S. Constitution. We cut out the parts that we thought were really important, and we teach them to one another. You know, they said, you know, that you have a right to not face an illegal search and seizure. They said, we learned that's not just for citizens, that's for everyone. And we began to examine the Constitution and talk about how the people who were enforcing the law in our community weren't following the Constitution. And they said in our little groups, we started to document that, you know, to tell one another the stories we'd heard, and then to go and interview the people and write down what had happened. And we took those stories to the El Paso Times, and the El Paso Times ran this expose of illegal searches and seizures and abuses that were happening in homes when homes were raided on the El Paso side of the border by Border Patrol agents. And when this expose came out, they said the Border Patrol asked us if we wanted to meet with them. And so we went in, we sat down and met with them, and we started cleaning up the way they were practicing their profession. But they said, then we had a chance to tell them what we wanted, and we said, we want to understand from you what your job is, because we think we've read that you're supposed to make sure that people who don't have documentation to come across on this side don't come in. They said, yeah, that's our job. And they said, okay, where's the line? Like, where's the line that we can't cross, or that somebody from the other side can't cross? And they said, well, it's in the middle of the river. And they said, well, a lot of us would like to see our family members who we don't get to see, and would there be any violation of the law if we met in the middle of the river? And the Border Patrol said, well, technically no, as long as you both went back to your own sides. So they said we started what we call our Hugs Not Walls program, where we arrange for families to meet in the middle of the river, and that's what they had invited us to participate in. We went down to the river on a Sunday morning, and we did our own singing. We sang Wade in the Water, and we rolled our pants up, and we walked out there, and a woman named Maria told me about how her husband had been deported shortly after the Trump administration began, and that he had reconnected with two of their sons on that side of the border, one of whom she had not seen in 17 years. And she said, we're going to have a family reunion today. And so they did. They were on a little sandbar in the middle of the Rio Grande. They had a little reunion just for a little bit. And then the Border Patrol said time was up and we had to go back our separate ways. But when I was coming out on the other side of the river and beginning to, roll my pants back down and put my shoes on, I looked up across on the other side, on the Juarez side, up on the mountain. And years ago, somebody put in these white stones on that side of the mountain in Spanish, in letters huge enough that you can read it from anywhere in town. The Bible is the truth. Read it. And I read that, and I thought about this this family values movement that in so many ways I was born into. I was born here in North Carolina in 1980. We were just talking about this. It was, they announced my birth in the little Southern Baptist church my family was a member of up in Stokes County the Sunday after Ronald Reagan was elected president in the fall of 1980. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I was born into the beginnings of what historians now call the religious right, right? The people who organized to target communities like the one I was growing up in to politicize us for a very particular agenda. And I didn't know much about why they did that or the history of that, but as I grew up, I just breathed in that air and sort of swam in that water, and I was an earnest kid who walked the aisle to accept Jesus as my Lord and Savior when I was 7 years old. And once Jesus was my Savior, I wanted to do all that I could for Jesus. And so I wanted to be President of the United States. Because in that context, that was the best thing you could do. And so I started down that road, and I was being trained up as a foot soldier in these culture wars, right? Where the moral issues, the religious issues, the values issues were very clear, and they were very narrow, right? It was just about abortion and prayer in schools and human sexuality. And we were supposed to know who we should vote for just based on who kind of lined up around those few issues. And we were supposed to trust that those people were doing God's work. And frankly, as a kid, I believed it. I believed it was that simple, and that what was really needed was dedication and hard work. So that's what I was trying to do. And I went to the U.S. Senate as a page when I was still in high school, and I worked for Strom Thurmond from across the border in South Carolina. And I began to learn a little bit about history and a little bit about the fact that this man, who was a so-called family values politician in the 1990s, had at one time been the Dixiecrat candidate for president. And I began to see that his politics hadn't changed that much. His party had changed. Some of his language had changed. But who he thought ought to be in charge and how he thought this country ought to work had not changed in his life. And here he was in his 90s. And for me, that was the beginning of recognizing that there was something wrong with this frame. There was something wrong with this story that says the religious values are those values that would strictly back this one party, this one agenda. And if you're going to be faithful, you have to line up with those things. Now, fast forward to where we are today. I think there are a lot of folks realizing today that there's something wrong, right? That the President of the United States, in the midst of any number of scandals and outright policy violence, is still standing up at rallies and saying, my presidency has brought about a revival of Christianity in America. He just said it this past week in Louisiana. There's something wrong about that narrative, and there's a strong reaction against this, what's usually described now as Christian nationalism. But what I have spent my whole adult life trying to understand, and the reason I wrote this book after I saw those words that said, the Bible is the truth, read it. I wanted to understand, how did we come to a place where both in the church and in society more broadly, we read the Bible and often assume that it does line up with this so-called Christian nationalist agenda. Or the folks who read it in a different way get marginalized and pushed to the side and really aren't at the center of conversations about our public life. People end up feeling like if their values lead them somewhere else, they can't really talk about their values because the values terrain has been claimed by what I really believe is a false moral narrative. How did that happen? And how could we learn to talk about values differently? That's really what this book is about and what I'd like our conversation here today to be about. Let me just tell you a few things that I learned in brief, and you can certainly dig in more in the book to see how these things played out. But what I learned as I began to research how values got shaped in this way is that after the civil rights movement in this country, and very much in the midst of the women's rights movement, when the ratification of the ERA was a central political issue in the country in the 1970s, there were operatives within what was called the New Right, political people, people who were doing surveys and analyzing data and trying to understand how they could help people like Strom Thurmond hold on to power in the South and in the country. Those folks looked around, they looked at how demographics were changing and how the conversation in the country was changing in the post civil rights era, and they realized something. Kevin Phillips is probably the most famous analyst who described this. He said, the coalition that we need to stay in power is in the South, the suburbs, and the Sun Belt. He was talking about white people, but he didn't use racial language. He said the South, the suburbs, and the Sun Belt. That's who we need to hold on to power. And he said when George Wallace ran for president that he realized that you couldn't talk in the way that you used to talk to white people to rally them around your agenda, that you had to find new ways to talk to this coalition of people. And as they sat and talked about what was the best way to bring people together, they came to a consensus that what they needed to do was translate white values into religious values. They needed to give people religious language to vote for what they had voted for based on their racial identity. And that's when a guy named Paul Weyrich, who started the Heritage Foundation and the American Legislative Exchange Council and several other organizations that have built the coalition that has created this conversation in this country, not the least of which is the Round Table. This is a different kind of circle, but the Round Table, where much of this has been negotiated for the past 40 years, called the Council for National Policy. He went to Jerry Falwell, and he said to Falwell, a Baptist preacher from Virginia who had started a segregation academy out of his church, right? He had gotten involved in politics as part of the massive resistance effort in Virginia, and in that movement had become politicized in such a way that that he then began to use his church, and of course the church's property and nonprofit status, to subvert the federal government's attempts to desegregate schools. He and many churches like his started these segregation academies, and they were very angry in the late 1970s because the Carter administration's IRS was beginning to crack down on them and say you weren't going to be able to use your church's nonprofit status and buildings that were paid for under that nonprofit status to subvert the federal government's desegregation of schools. And Weyrich said to Jerry Falwell, this is a chance to politicize people in this moment. And we can do it around saying that progressives are trying to attack family and life. We'll start a pro-life, pro-family movement, and we'll be able to bring these people together around these values, a kind of nostalgia for the way things used to be, without saying the South will rise again, right? In fact, it was saying that these are the values that are the real values at the heart of religion and faith. And these are the values at the heart of a constitutional democracy. They began to develop that narrative, and for 40 years have been building out a coalition. Falwell's wasn't big enough. It was mostly just white Baptists in the South and the Midwest, and so they started including Pentecostals. There's a lot of this history in the book, how radio came along, and in many places where traditional media was being hollowed out, these independent Christian radio and TV stations began to become a main source of news for people. But this became a way of shaping the whole way people saw the world. And this became a dominant narrative in our public life because the multiple organizations that were pushing this narrative were constantly going to the local paper, going on national TV about narrow wedge issues that they believed would bring people of faith to side with them over and against the folks that they were trying to scare people into believing were going to destroy their values. That's a brief version of the story. But here's the other story, right? The story that hasn't been told nearly often enough. That as a matter of fact, the movements that they were pushing back against had been led by people who were deeply motivated by their faith and their values, right? What they were realizing is that the most famous moral voice of the 1960s had been a preacher from Georgia who talked about the need for justice to roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. He was quoting Amos, the prophet, right out of the Bible. Folks like Dr. King and the ministers in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the women of deep faith like Fannie Lou Hamer, who quoted the Bible about every time she opened her mouth. Ella Baker, who grew up right here in North Carolina, sitting beside her granddaddy, who was a preacher in church, and whose whole vision of radical democratic organizing was rooted in that church and the women's society of that church she'd grown up in. All of these people were also deeply rooted in faith and in values. And as a matter of fact, those values have also been incredibly important throughout the history of our country, right? That all of the movements that have changed our country for the better, and this is, in terms of a broad consensus of things that almost all of us believe today are true and good. The abolition of slavery, the weekend, and the 40-hour work week, and the idea that children ought not work in factories and lose half their hand before they become adults. Like all the labor movement, the women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, all of these movements were deeply moral movements where people of faith, often different faiths, but nevertheless, having a common concern for values that brought them together, lived out that faith in public life. And so this book is really out of my experience with the Poor People's Campaign today, recognizing that there are people all across the country who are living out their faith when it comes to voting rights, when it comes to advocating for immigration reform and immigration justice, when it comes to access to health care and living wages, advocacy for the environment, right, and for care for our common home, when it comes to challenging the militarism that sucks up so much of the money in our federal budget without really, improving security or domestic tranquility in any measurable way. One issue after another, there are people of faith and people who are rooted in values who are working to transform these things, and these people are everywhere. They're right here in your community. They're right here in this circle. So what I'd like to do to kind of launch us into our conversation, I just want to read from the conclusion of this book to give you a little taste of where I think this can take us. And then I'd like y'all to introduce yourselves in terms of your own values and how you're putting them into practice around issues that matter to this community. The religious right was not wrong to tell people of faith that the Bible is political. Its critical mistake and enduring sin is not that it challenged Christians to engage in public life, but that it invited us to join a reactionary coalition driven by racial fear, male chauvinism, and corporate greed. Decent people with sincere motives joined the moral majority and the Christian coalition to put their faith into practice, but these organizations made fallible people worse than we would have been otherwise. They led us astray. I know from personal experience how much any attempt to live out my faith in public life must begin with repentance. The sackcloth and ashes of Scripture are appropriate, especially for white Christians in our present moment. We have sinned, and our sin has not only stained our souls, it has made life more difficult for millions and threatens to destroy life itself on this planet. The fire this time could just as easily be a nuclear holocaust as a wildfire like the one that is consuming large swaths of California as I write. But repentance, I have also learned, is more than feeling guilt and saying we were wrong. Repentance is turning around and going in the other direction. It means listening to the people who have suffered most from the false moral narrative I was caught up in and joining with them to offer our neighbors a better story about who we might become. The gift of moral fusion politics is that it offers us both a history we can learn from and a future we can join. A coalition not led or convened by majority white faith leaders, but one where we can all nevertheless find our place in a moral movement. Donald Trump's presidency has created a moral crisis, both within the Republican Party and in American public life. It would be irresponsible to ignore this fact, but it would also be naive to pretend that Trumpism somehow emerged apart from the moral narrative that the religious right preached for 4 decades. The policy violence that presses down on poor people, undocumented people, people of color, and the earth is being executed in God's name. We cannot, as a people, retreat to an apolitical faith that tries not to engage public life any more than an individual can pursue spiritual health without addressing the body's physical needs. While spiritual formation and pastoral care within congregations are essential to Christian discipleship, our public witness is equally important. Now, as ever, we must be prepared, as St. Peter said, to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. When we point out that faith in American public life has been exploited by the Republican Party, we are neither endorsing the Democratic Party by default, nor counting out the possibility of Republicans changing course. A moral movement must push both parties to address issues that impact women, children, the poor, the undocumented, the environment, the most vulnerable among us, whom the prophets will not let us forget. There is nothing partisan about insisting that everybody has a right to live, to learn, to enjoy the fruit of their labor, to have access to health care, and to receive equal protection under the law. To call policies that deny our neighbors these basic rights conservative is not only an act of violence against our neighbors, it's also a misrepresentation of conservatism. When we resist extremism within the Republican Party, we do not deny that there are things we should all work to conserve in the American Republic. Instead, we insist that those basic values are more important than any party's political power. Many who, like me, were caught up in the deception of the religious right worry that a religious left could easily mirror the mistakes of the past 40 years. It is true that political power will corrupt without regard for party or affiliation. But a moral movement can practice political realism while warning against the dangers of partisanism. When we lift up the voices of people who are hurting and endorse policies that would impact the material circumstances of our lives, we can then use the power of our voices and our votes to support politicians who promise to make those policies law. If they are Democrats in one election, that is no guarantee that they will be a generation from now. I learned from Strom Thurmond that politicians can switch parties without giving up their biases or their grip on power. So this is the revolution of values that I'm hopeful for and that I actually see happening. One that takes seriously our moral formation and our moral obligations and takes seriously how we flesh that out in public, but leaves room for something beyond the divisions that we so often assume, right? Progressive versus traditional, left versus right, conservative versus liberal, Democrats versus Republicans. I think that framing has been used to lead us into the kind of immorality that we see around us today. And so it's so important for us to gather. And when we gather, to talk about what really matters, what values Mama taught us, and our synagogue or our congregation, our community that raised us taught us, and how are we living out those values in our direct engagement with issues in our public life. Let's talk about that. Which way should we go around the circle? I'd love for you to just say who you are and where you're coming from, and how your values led you to what you're doing. Can we go this way?
Hi, good evening. I'm Jessica Shore-Sachs. My issue is healthcare. And I grew up in a home that was very strong on ethics and on social justice, although that wasn't what we called it then. But with a real sense from my parents that what we needed to do was not just to say give to the poor, but that what we needed to do was to create a better society so that people wouldn't be poor and wouldn't suffer. My family is Jewish. My parents were secular. They never taught us any of this in Jewish terms. However, later on, as I learned more about Judaism and some of the principles of Judaism, I came to think that somehow through the generations, Jewish values really permeated my parents, and that was what they taught us. And there are just a couple of these that I would like to bring up that have really struck me and stayed with me. So one is the concept of tikkun olam. Tikkun olam literally means repairing the world. And it's an obligation for Jews to do what they can in little and big ways to make repairs in the world so that the world becomes a better place for all of us. And one of the ways that this can be done is through tzedakah. Now, tzedakah, I don't know how many people might be familiar with that word, but when I learned it, that word is usually translated as charity. Like in our homes, we have tzedakah boxes. We put quarters in for charity. But actually, that's not what the word means. It comes from the word tzedek, and tzedek means justice. And the idea of doing tzedakah is that it is something that is not optional, like charity is. Like if you feel flush today, you give something to somebody. The idea of tzedakah is that it's an obligation, that you have to carry out this work to make the world a more just place, and you don't have any option about it. And what I learned from reading your book is that it seems to me that it relates to the idea of the social gospel, that this is the work that we have to do. So those are two principles that have guided me for a long time, as well as the other lessons of my home. My professional work was to be a family doctor and to work with the underserved and to carry it out in that way. And now in my retirement, I work on Healthcare Justice North Carolina, in which what we do is promote Medicare for all, which is the way that we feel that we can really bring justice in healthcare to people, with everybody getting equitable quality healthcare.
Thank you. And I love in your sharing how, like, this formation that you experienced expressed itself in your vocation as a doctor, but you're also, like, being a doctor means wanting everybody to have access to health care. I think that's hugely important. Yeah. Steve?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Steve Cohen. I've been here in Charlotte for a little more than 20 years. Recently, 3-4 years ago, retired from law practice, and currently am an affordable housing advocate. When I thought about the question that Jonathan asked us to consider tonight, I wanted to take a step back and think about, where did my values come from? And I thought first about my faith, second about my family, and third about kind of what I've found out as I've lived my life. Jessica has described the role that Judaism has played in my life as it played in her life. I do think it's important to understand that when we talk about Jews, it's a religion, but we're also really a people. And for me, at least, the formative experience of being Jewish goes back millennia. It was being freed from slavery. And it's so important in Jewish identity that we actually not only retell the story, but we symbolically relive the pains of slavery and being freed from slavery as part of the Passover Seder every year. So the values that come out of that for me are a strong sense of justice, and because we're taught to welcome the stranger, a strong sense of compassion. Then to my family, so I grew up in a family where my mom and my dad were both alike but very different. My mom was a social justice warrior. She was a feminist before that word was coined. And she told me when I was older that when she read The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, it's like the light bulb went off. She wasn't alone. And she marched and she protested and she made life uncomfortable for my dad because he was very ambitious, a smart guy, and he was able to live the American dream. When he was 17, it was in 1944, he left home to go to the Navy. He was very fortunate. It was near the end of the war, and he got sent to the Atlantic, not to the South Pacific, so he didn't really see any battle. What he did get was the benefit of having been a GI, so he got to go to college under the GI Bill. He was able to buy a starter home that we lived in until I was 15 with a very low interest VA mortgage. And, very focused. He had a very successful business career. So when as I got older, I became a lawyer, very focused. But I had this strong sense, and it wasn't something that I wanted to do. It's who I was, that a compulsion to be involved in social justice issues. And so as I started following along and figuring things out, I was distressed to learn that American dream that my dad had lived was denied to African Americans. First, because they weren't, for the most part, allowed to go to college under the GI Bill. And I was ashamed to find that out very late in my life. Why are they not teaching us this in school when we're younger? Generational wealth. My dad was able to buy his starter home with a very low interest rate loan, no money down, and prospered over the years. I was familiar with the concept of redlining, which meant that it was very hard for black families to get mortgages in certain neighborhoods. And I thought, well, it's those bad banks. Well, it turns out it wasn't really just the banks. And frankly, I represented banks for a while. I don't hate banks. Turns out that it was the federal government that until 1968, so I was leaving my teens in 1968, mandated that for credit reasons, mortgages not be made in certain neighborhoods. So all of this brought me to the area that I feel passionate about, which is bringing upward mobility to everyone so that everyone can live the American dream. Now that's kind of an amorphous concept. So to make that concrete, I was very fortunate to find my way to the Greenspan Center, Rabbi Judy Schindler, and I've, for the last couple of years, been an affordable housing advocate here in Charlotte, because without stable housing, almost nothing else is possible.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much.
Good evening. Can you all hear me? Oh, perfect. My name is Willie Ratchford, and I have the honor and pleasure of working as the executive director with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Community Relations Committee. I've been with that organization for 39 years doing this particular work, and have worked for the city of Charlotte for 44 years. Wow. My wife is trying to get me to retire, but that's another story.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you. So with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Community Relations Committee, we have two things that we are trying to accomplish. One, we want to promote community harmony and the ability of people, despite their differences, to be able to get along and to ameliorate the current effects of past discrimination, because what happened, to your point, 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 300 years ago, still impacts how we treat each other along racial lines in this community. And as I have thought about that term, ameliorate the current effects of past discrimination for the past 39 years, it has occurred to me that if we as a community or if we as a country really had lived up to our American constitutional values, if we had really lived up to our Christian values, there would be no need to have that conversation. I mean, the things that we do and the way we treat each other racially today, that would have been fixed a long time ago if we had lived up to our Christian values. I really appreciate some of the things that you were saying earlier, and it caused me to realize that as these different groups across the country have encapsulated their own values, I see us as a country that has a lot of bubbles. And contained in each bubbles are millions of people, and so there are millions of bubbles across the country, and all of the inhabitants of singular bubbles believe that their way is the only way in the gospel and the truth. And so if you got a million of these bubbles where everybody is thinking that somebody has to be wrong, everybody can't be right, because their beliefs or their values are so diametrically opposed. In fact, as I was listening to you, it occurs to me that our values have become our extremes. Our values have become our extremes. And anyone who disagrees with us, we can't even sit down and have civil conversation with them. We've got to castigate them. We've got to demonize them simply because they disagree with us. Yeah. Simply because they disagree with us. If you want to be a community where everybody thinks the same, then perhaps we should become a communist country, because everybody thinks the way you build communities the same way. That is not the American way. That is not the American way. One of the values that I've worked towards doing this 39 years with the Community Relations Committee is justice. And first of all, I want white people to understand that justice does not mean just us. All right. It's not just you. It's everybody. Right. My friend Julia Sane, who works with disability rights and resources, has a saying, and she says, "It's everybody or it's nobody." It's everybody or it's nobody. And I've come to realize over time in doing this work that I started this work in the wrong way, because in seeing racism, I tried to change individual human beings, and that is absolutely the wrong way to change racism. I've come to personally believe over the years that the vast majority of all people in this country, regardless of your race, the vast majority of people are not personally racist. But we live in a community and in a society where you don't have to personally be racist in order to enjoy the benefits of racism. It is our systems, it's our structures, it is those things that is doing the work of racism, and has been in place for 400 years now. We've got to change those structures and those institutions, and that is how we get racism to go. We're not attacking people as individuals. Yeah. I mean, even people who may have individual racism or bias or implicit or unconscious bias have no idea that they may be racist. It just doesn't occur to them. And when you confront them or attack them because of that, they genuinely give you that look. I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah. They really don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, they really don't. But so don't deal with individual human beings in trying to change their racist way. Work on your own racist way, but deal with the institutions and the structures. It is that systemic racism that impacts us all. And then something that a conversation I'm always having with my good friend Diane English. If we're going to deal with racism and our values, it simply means us taking time to understand that, to be honest with ourselves and to acknowledge that this country was intentionally built and created institutions and structures which were designed to benefit white people and designed to intentionally leave people of color out. Yeah. And so that's why you have people like Steve who will say, I went to college on the GI Bill, or my father went to college on the GI Bill, and with the FHA loans that happened in the 40s, we were able to buy homes and get equity and send our kids to school and build wealth. And these very black soldiers who fought in the war with his father for this country, giving life and limb, were not afforded that same ability. And the way that a lot of us have dealt with it in this community and in this room, I'm sure, is just to pretend that this racism doesn't exist. Or if it does exist, it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
That's what we need to change.
Thank you. You know, one of the things that all three of you share in common, I just want to note this as we're going along, is that your values have led you to challenge systems. A medical system, a housing system, a racialized system that creates unequal outcomes, right? I think that's really important because often when we think about values, it's very personal. Often when we think about faith, you know, it's very personalized. And here's a shared value, you know, among your different stories, that there are values that lead us to talk about what we share in common and how our systems work. How about for you?
So I got a recommendation for everyone here. Never sit on the left-hand side of Willie Ratchford. I've been a lot of places with him. I need to sit on the right-hand side. My name is Rachel Humphreys, and I work with Refugee Support Services here in Charlotte. So I have the benefit of working with people who don't have to guess whether or not they are facing racism. They are persecuted for it. They have immigration forced on them. They have incarceration forced on them. They are tortured because of it. They are tortured and incarcerated and forced to immigrate because the shape of their head is not the right shape, because the color of their skin is wrong, or because their religion doesn't match up with their governments. So there's no question with the people that I work with, and that they find themselves here. But I think one of the values that propels me to work in this field and in this way came from my mama. And I grew up in Winston-Salem in the Moravian Church.
All right.
And there's a lot of equality in the Moravian Church. You can see it. Has anyone ever been to Old Salem? Have you been to the cemetery? So if you took the tour, they told you this, but if you didn't, I'm going to give you some free tour guide, some free tour guide information here. In Old Salem, the Moravians believe that when you come into the world, you are equal, and when you leave the world, you are equal with every other person that you pass through this world with. So when you die, regardless of who you are or who you were, you don't get to put a monument on your tombstone. You're just equal with everybody else. And so I think my mother ingrained that into me, into my sisters and brother, when every Easter we had to march ourselves down to that cemetery and take a bucket of soapy water and clean those tombstones. Does anyone else have that history of cleaning tombstones with their family every single solitary Easter when everybody else has their Easter basket and chocolates and candy and we're down there scrubbing the tombstones? That was our tradition. And I didn't realize that my mother, as we were doing that, every one of my relatives' tombstone was all the same size. And so it was a visual message to us that we're all equal. And so when I met Het, who is a Vietnam, a Montagnard refugee, and he told me that he had been imprisoned just for being a Christian, and he dug out of the prison because they made him only eat salt, and then they captured him again, and they put him back in prison a second time, and they fed him only salt. and he dug his way out again. And this time when he started to run, he kept running until he met the United Nations. And he got to the United States, and I met him, and I met his wife, and I met his children. I realized that he was not a terrorist, first of all. He was not part of a tidal wave of immigration that has hit our shores, or an invasion of people that are here to take over, which we hear that a lot. What he was just a husband, and he was a soccer dad, and he was a taxpayer. And he, like a lot of immigrants, just are here to be a family person. And another value that I learned with some of my high school friends are even here. We learned in high school early on to, look up to God. And as we were learning about who Jesus was for kind of the first and real times in our lives, we were learning to look up and then out, and look up and look out. And that was the cross, was the symbol of that. And I remember looking up and out and thinking, well, then it's simple. You look up to Jesus, and then you look out to your neighbors. And I just think over and over that crossbar that is one of our symbols in the Christian church, it isn't slanted, which means nothing goes on a downward slope. What I have to serve in this world is no better than what anybody, I'm not given downward service. What I do when we reach out, it's equal. And it just reminded me of my mother's teaching that we are all equal. So now when I work with refugees right here in Charlotte and help them just find a way to make a home here, I'm just reminded of the values that my parents, my family, and then my faith has instilled in me, and then how to live that out outside of the walls of the church and outside of the walls of our houses.
Thank you.
Good evening. I am Monty Witherspoon. I'm a pastor of the Still Creek Game Design Church in Southwest Charlotte. Most recently, I was a candidate for Charlotte Methodist School Board at large. We raised a question about values and what we spoke about values. What shapes our values? And I appreciate. I got through a portion of your text. What shapes our values? And I really like how you talked about basically the hermeneutic, or the lens in which certain communities read the Bible. And for me, as I read the Bible as a Christian, I come from a tradition, a church who was on the forefront of fighting against slavery, forefront of civil rights movement. We've always been involved in the community and for justice. And so it concerns me because when I read the Bible, particularly when I read about Jesus, Jesus wasn't just as a little baby in a manger.
All right.
Jesus was a radical revolutionary. And for this little black boy, man, that turned me on. Particularly as one who identifies with the marginalized and oppressed. Yeah. And so it baffles me. How can we read about Jesus and not talk about health care when Jesus, when we talk about miracles, has made miracles with healing folks who are on the margins of society, those lepers? How can we not be concerned about health care, about institutions and empires who oppress their own folks? And so I think we have to question our hermeneutic and how it shapes our values, I believe, and how we interpret the text. So for me, I come from a long tradition, a long prophetic tradition of fighting for justice. And so as I read the Bible, and even as I read the Hebrew Bible, we talk about mishpat, this whole motif of justice that Jesus picks up and continues on. I cannot live my faith quietly. I am called, we are summoned to be involved in the community and fight for justice and to speak up for the voiceless. And and to challenge powers that keep folks oppressed. And it's not just, and we talk about, we sort of racialize that, man, it's poor white people too. And I learned that even when I was running for school board. You know, it's supposed to be nonpartisan. Folks walk up to you, ask me, what are you, Democrat or a Republican? I say it's nonpartisan. They still want the answer. And so it's, you know, I say, well, I'm a Democrat. Well, I'm not voting for you. I was like, your grandchildren need this just as much as other folks need my platform. And we have this polarization in America that is shaped by these values that really are misaligned, I think. So my focus has been, in short, not long, to really fight for educational equity for students who are just, we have so many concentrations of poverty, and students are just left behind. So if we want to talk about upward mobility, we have to talk about education and educational justice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Monty. I mean, what I have to say is kind of an interesting contrast to you, because you talk about being this little black boy who's just amazed by the revolutionary figure of Jesus. And I grew up sort of in the church and with a sense that if you saw something wrong, you ought to do something about it if you could. But to be honest, as a you know, young white girl growing up in the suburbs whose father also rode the way, a little younger than yours, but who was, you know, had risen and did very well, I didn't see much that needed fixing. I mean, I just didn't see it. It was all around me, but I didn't see it, you know. So if I thought, well, if there's something out there, I ought to do it. But you know, for me, the stories about that kind of work they were either sort of fantasy stories like the Lord of the Rings, you know, that kind of thing, or they were in the past, you know, like World War II, like maybe the stories about, you know, those were the things that had needed fixing, and I just didn't see. My parents were good people, but they were not social justice warriors. They didn't focus. They focused on helping. They were doctor, teacher, but not in a, you know, not in a strong sense. So I kind of went on through life, sort of doing what I could here and there, and then I really became more involved when my son was going to go to school. And we lived in a neighborhood that was assigned to elementary school that had been one of the 6 lowest performing schools in the entire state of North Carolina. And in our neighborhood, middle-class people who had choices did not send their children to Shamrock Gardens Elementary. And I was very disturbed. Schools were resegregating, and Shamrock had actually resegregated much earlier than a lot of other schools. And so, you know, I said, here my son's coming up to kindergarten. It seems like maybe this is wrong. I knew that I was sort of beginning to really understand this was wrong, and maybe I could do something about that. And so we ended up working with the amazing Louise Woods, who's here somewhere, who was school board at the time, to create the circumstances that would make it possible to go to Shamrock, to build that school up for the children who were there, who were mostly of color, virtually all poor. The white kids who were there were poor too. You know, it was the small number. And just began to, you know, understand what it meant to personally be involved and to have your child with other children and work together with other people and sort of building up a growing understanding. I knew it was wrong, and then once I got there and saw the kids and what was going on, I really knew it was wrong then, and that something really needed to be done. And that's kind of what I've been working on ever since, is to change the structures of the school system so that schools get the support they need, but also to work with people who are afraid of schools like Shamrock, who worry that if they send their child to a school that doesn't seem to be the best school, that somehow they're doing their child a disservice, that they are, you know, not being a responsible parent. And that has something to do, I think, with the abstractness of how people see the Bible sometimes, with those sorts of things. And I see you ready to talk, so I'm going to let you.
Well, no, thank you.
Let you talk.
This is an incredible circle. You know, educational equity, refugees, and all the issues that, you know, they highlight in our society, racial equity, affordable housing, access to health care. These are issues that matter, and that you all are very articulate in terms of connecting them to your values. Now, we have 2 chairs in this circle that haven't been filled yet. So we're going to keep talking here, and I want to invite any of you who have a thought or a question that's occurred to you to rise from your seat like you would if you were at home, and just come on into the circle. Make yourself at home, because we don't have a whole lot of time to talk here, but I want to dive right in. So when you want to jump in, just stick your hand out and we'll get one of these 3 microphones around to you. But I want to ask those of you who've shared so powerfully, it seems like with the various issues that impact us, whether it's, a white mama and a black father who care about schools, everybody's got to have a house, everybody needs medical. It seems like there are more of us who have a common stake in these things than there are those who benefit from dividing. So why do you think it is that so often we do end up with these wedge issues that split us off in ways that allow folks who are really invested in continuing the inequities in these different systems to hold on to power? What's keeping us divided?
I think one of the things that keeps us divided, and this is something I garnered from my work in the Community Relations Committee over the years, is the failure of us to have relationships across racial and ethnic lines. So over the years, we've had these race relation dialogues in the community, especially early on. And it was really amazing to me that when white folk and black folk, and I don't mean to leave other ethnic groups out, but back in the day when I started this work, diversity in this community meant black folk and white folk. That's the reality of it. But it always amazed me that when black folk and white folk got together and in the room to talk to each other about race, both groups were always shocked and surprised as to how much they had in common, simply because they sat down and had the conversation. Now, initially, from the very beginning, these conversations were difficult because we would just grab a bunch of black folk and a bunch of white folk and throw them in a room and say, okay, you guys have an honest dialogue on race, only to realize later on that these folk thought that we were absolutely crazy, and we were. But what we realized over time is that in order for blacks and white to have honest, substantive dialogue about race and recognize the commonalities so that we don't let others do our thinking for us and divide us, we must have relationships first. It is about relationships. It is difficult for whites and blacks to have conversations about race, but if you have relationships, it becomes a very, very easy conversation. So I think it's just sitting down together and talking and getting to know each other and recognizing what we have in common.
And I want to add to that, because I think in Charlotte that happened somewhat more when the schools were desegregated, when there was busing, when people really were structurally brought together and had to have those conversations because all their kids were in school together. And I think creating those places where people really do, not just, one weekend a month or a year or something like that, but where people really are brought together with something significant at stake.
It's a structural issue, right? It's a systemic issue. I was with Ibram Kendi yesterday, who has been teaching in a powerful way the history of the country to help people see that the systems of white supremacy were built first. The ideas followed to justify the system. Whether they were religious ideas or scientific ideas or sociological ideas, the ideas were there to prop up the system. So one of the things he often says is that racist people have been very well educated. You're not going to educate people out of racism. You're going to have to change the system so that we can have these conversations, so that we can see things that we wouldn't see when we're participating in systems that divide us. And in so many ways, I think we get divided along the racial lines, but we also get divided by issues, right? the folks who are working on housing aren't often talking to the folks who are working on refugee issues or the folks who are working on healthcare issues. And we don't realize that when it comes to power in our communities, we're running up against some of the same folk, right? The same forces that don't want everybody to have access to health care also don't want everybody to have affordable housing, right? Also want to privatize and resegregate the schools. And so in some ways, the kind of coalitions that we need to build need to be cross-racial, cross-gender, but also cross-issue, so that we can begin to recognize the ways that we share a lot in common in terms of the powers that we need to see change. Yeah.
So I think a lot of what keeps us divided on these things is disinformation. It's people who feel they have some interests out there and making other people believe things that really aren't in their best interests, and that goes back to segregation and relatively wealthy white people trying to make poor white people think that they were better than black people and not see their common self-interest. And where I see it in healthcare is a sense out there about healthcare, as with other issues. I believe that it's a zero-sum game, and that a lot of people will talk about healthcare in that, well, if somebody else gets healthcare, that must mean something is being taken away from me. And that's completely wrong about healthcare, as with other issues. The truth about healthcare is it's one way in society that we all do better if everyone does better. And with regard to what you just said about getting together around issues, one of the things that has really struck me, and it struck me in practice, is how much these issues intersect, so that the relationship, and they go both ways. For instance, the relationship between education and healthcare is that the better educated people are, the better their health is. And so that in healthcare, we would do very well to be encouraging people and encouraging to society for people to have good educations. If we raise a generation of people who are illiterate, they're not going to be able to read the instructions on their medications. And that's just one tiny thing, but how do we expect them to be healthy? But on the other hand, if our children and people are healthier, they're better able to learn. And there's intersection with all the issues that we're talking about tonight in healthcare, and I agree with you that we need to see this all more broadly.
I was going to add that I think also that fear is something that keeps us just frozen, and words. And I think words are used to make us fearful. So we hear a lot from our federal government about the invasion of folks that are coming, or we hear about the tidal wave of people. Does this not work? Okay. So I think words really matter, because words are currently being used as a weapon against us to keep us fearful, so we don't know what's the truth. And I think words are important. I think words like calling people illegal is important to understand that people are not illegal. People might have documents or they might not, but they're not illegal. And it's important to learn the current words and not let words make us fearful. And then I think individually it's important for us to not be afraid to call it out when we see it. I will tell you that Kathy Farley changed my life when I was in college, when I went to tell her a joke. And I said, "Hey, Kathy, a black man and a white man went into a bar." And she said, "Stop right there. Why does it matter?" And I said, "Because I'm getting ready to tell you a joke. It's going to be really funny. You're going to love it." And she was not afraid to stop me. And this was in the 80s, early 80s. And she made me pause. And it changed my life forever. Kathy Farley changed my life forever, because she was willing to not be afraid on an individual level and to risk our friendship and call me out. And I'm grateful she set me on a path. But I think words, and I think we've got to find a way to address our fear as individuals and call each other out in love, and then not let words make us be afraid to move our systems.
It does say somewhere in there that love drives out fear. And in some ways, I think what we're reaching for here is a politics of love, not in some kind of, way that floats above issues, but that engages, right, our neighbors with genuine love. How can we build a society where all of us can thrive? That's the question I hear all of you asking. And we want to continue this conversation, but we want to bring some other people in. So we're going to spread out a little bit. But before we do, I just wanted to say that one of the images from the Bible that has become really precious to me, and I think roots what we're talking about here in a biblical vision, a biblical value, is in Psalm 118, the psalm that we sometimes sing in Christian churches when we sing, "This is the day that the Lord has made," and we get all happy, and we're excited because, it's a new day and we're alive and all of those things are good. And we're saying it's a gift from God and we're going to celebrate that. But we rarely back up a little bit before that verse in Psalm 118 where the psalmist says why we're excited that this is God's day. Why we know it's God's day. Because the psalmist says, the stones that the builder rejected have become the chief cornerstones, and it is marvelous in our eyes. This is the day that the Lord has made, and we will rejoice and be glad in it. Across all of the issues, when we find the people who are being rejected in society, when we find the people in our communities who've been denied health care, who've been denied affordable housing, who've been treated bad because of the color of their skin, who've been, denied quality education or denied welcome, when they flee here from somewhere else. Those rejected stones actually become the people who can show us what this story that we've inherited is really about, right? Jesus was a refugee baby. Jesus was a black man. If you read the story in America, right? And, Pharaoh's army got drowned, but the people who had been rejected came out, and God was with those who were crying out for justice. I think that's a way of reclaiming the story and finding how the story can draw us together. So I'm really grateful to have this conversation, and I do want to open it up. What we've done is we've got some snacks. We've got a few tables where there's more information about some of these organizations that are doing this work in the community, but we also got, all these chairs and space where we can continue to talk to one another about how to do this here in Charlotte. And you've got some incredible resource people right here. Now, the resource that I want to offer is I've written this book to try to help faith communities have this conversation. And it's a very good book. Well, thank you. But I'm serious about this. I am not a salesman. I've lived my whole life believing in God's economy, which I believe means that there will always be enough for what we really need to do. So the organization I work for gives the books out right away. They're over here, and I want you to have it. Now, we've been doing this for 15 years because we've been supported by the people who believe in what we're doing. So if you want to make a donation to the School for Conversion, you can do cash, check, or you can pay online to the School for Conversion. But really, I want everybody who wants a book to take it and share this conversation with people people in your community, because I really do believe that we're in a moment when there is great potential for these stones to come together, for us to unite with the many, many people who are crying out in this land for justice, to come together and to change the systems that we share in common, the unjust systems that we've inherited, into something different. It is possible. And here in North Carolina, I have to say, one of the greatest testimonies to the possibility of change is the incredible resistance to it. They would not be fighting this hard to hold on to voter suppression and gerrymandering and every last way to manipulate control if they didn't know that the demographics in this state and the potential coalition of people who could join together is at a place where we really can change things. And that's what gives me hope in this moment. And I deeply believe that people of faith need to be part of that along with all of our neighbors. So thank you for coming out tonight. Thanks to each of you. Please give our circle here a hand. And please continue the conversation at tables, in the chairs, and wherever we are. Good to be with you all.